have questions and comments, we'll move along to Professor Grenzer and probably extend slightly beyond the stated end.
Well, I'll try to be relatively brief. I could just say, if you're interested, somewhere in the future I'll be teaching a D399 course on democracy and corporate citizenship, and I could just say, come see that class. But actually, I completed a course on that previous semester not so long ago. And it raises a lot of interesting topics of the sorts that are engaged in the recent controversy over the campus decisions regarding Chick-fil-A. I want to kind of step backwards for just a second and think about the way in which universities and corporations are alike in some ways. Both of them have a few basic functions that we associate them with most groups. Education and research for a university, creating value and profiting for a corporation. And yet we're both aware of these as institutions that have many more things going on around them. They are nested in communities, and those communities often expect, ask, desire things from them, and sometimes those who run those institutions, corporations and universities, engage in those communities in a variety of ways. Now, corporations and universities are different because the things that they're creating, the ways in which they go about it, often incorporate different types of values that, especially in the context of a university, can sometimes be conflicting within the institution itself. But let me focus on corporations just for a moment, because one of the subtitles of this very discussion today is, should public universities consider corporate donations, business practices, or support for specific political ideological groups when making decisions about university contracts? And you might step back for a second and say, well, why would a corporation ever give any of its money to anybody or anything? And what does it kind of mean for a corporation to do so? And again, as corporations are often kind of cautious and hesitant about doing so. Corporations are primarily organized in order to generate profits for investors. And to sort of put one way of thinking about this, refer back to a premier corporate spokesperson, in many ways, Michael Jeffrey Jordan, who was asked back in 1994 to support the candidacy of Democratic candidate from North Carolina, Harvey Gantt, who was running against Jesse Helms for North Carolina Senate. Jordan, being savvy about the NBA and savvy about his night contracts and his Gatorade contracts and every other contract under the sun, said, Republicans buy sneakers too, and they usually pay full price. And what he was saying is, I'm not in the business of politics. I'm not in the business of social commentary. I'm in the business of playing basketball and selling product. And lots of corporations like to be right there most of the time. Not all of them. First of all, some corporations say, the reason why I'm generating product is I'm going to do something in this world with that profit. So corporations close to us, like Amway up in Grand Rapids, or Whole Foods, say part of our mission, part of what we do is not just to generate profit, to create value only understood as monetary profit, but to create value in terms of a social profit as well, social value, where we speak to our communities by terms of the values that we create in our corporation when we're doing what we do, and as we express ourselves to our communities. So whether it's the type of food that we sell, the type of business practices that we bring in, or when we are asked who we donate to, be that a social group, be that through, and this gets very complicated, we won't get into legal issues, political groups. But in doing so, by engaging fully, and not just being profit generators in terms of the bottom line, but being value members of a society in some ways, those who create value for a society beyond simply the bottom line. Corporations recognize, as Michael Jordan was intuiting back in 1994, that they can place themselves in a society that's not going to make everybody happy. They will make choices by who they give money to. They will make choices by the practices they engage in. They will create controversies. So many corporations shy away from that. They will give money to both major political parties. They will make sure through their corporate giving offices that they will say, we're going to make sure that whoever comes and asks us, well, is this reasonable? We're fairly, within a very wide range. You know, we've got a corporation giving office that will generate a certain amount of whatever it might be. But in doing so, they're making a choice to be active in our communities. Sometimes because we ask them to. We say to Steak and Shake, will you help us sponsor our athletics programs, right? It's going to help us out if you do so. We're asking them to engage in society. By doing so, they are stepping into an arena in which citizens have disagreements about fundamental issues. Maybe not about IU, SB, Titans, athletics, but about other sorts of issues along the way. Right? So about a year and a half ago, the CEO of Whole Foods got into a lot of trouble when he published, well, maybe he didn't get in trouble, we'll see. Got in a lot of trouble in some ways when he published an an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal decrying the, at that time, yet not passed Health Care Act that was being proposed in Congress by the Democrats. And this came as a shock to many of the people who shopped at Whole Foods, saying, wait a minute, how could he not be in favor of the Health Care Act? I thought he was a good organic lefty. But actually keeps in mind many of the principles that he stands for, which is this for individual corporations to decide how to treat their actors. He's also elsewhere. But it meant by him taking that stand, he had to accept the slings and arrows of public scrutiny. That some people were going to say, I'm not going to shop at Whole Foods, and others would say they would. When we ask corporations to engage in political life, and a little over a year ago, the Supreme Court says they are members of, corporations as units are members of our political life, then we also can engage with them the way we do fellow citizens, deliberate them, engage them, and critically evaluate the actions that they take in the same way that we do each other. For universities, this becomes complex then, because for universities, we have to sort of think of ways in which we embody sometimes values that in and of themselves can be incoherent at a certain level. Right? We want to praise as open speech as we can, but we also want to recognize that certain forms of speech can close down speech by others. We want to be open to the ways in which people bring their lives to this campus, and then we also want to recognize when we're preserving the value of equality, that by doing that, others will say, those are lifestyle choices that we don't respect. What is the university doing protecting those when this state or this populace that supports the university might not do so? So it becomes difficult for a university to take any step in some ways. Whether it's with contracting, or the student group we're going to organize on practice, or somebody wants to advertise in the preface, whatever it might be, without in some ways taking a stand that's going to step on somebody's toes. And I guess that's the last thing I want to say very, very briefly, is there is a mistaken impression, I think, that there would be the possibility for a neutral position regarding any of these controversial issues, whether it be by a corporation or a university. But I don't think that there is. I think any choice is going to be made by a corporation to fund or not to fund, to be socially active or not, to give or not to give, for a university to examine practices of vendors or not to examine practices of vendors. Each one of those is actually a stand in some way. So the mistake, from my perspective, is not to think, well, there is a neutral position that has been crossed by either the corporation or by the university, but to evaluate what were the components of the judgment that get called upon to recognize that when we engage in sort of deliberation with each other in the university or with the constituencies outside of the university, that those judgments are going to call upon sometimes incompatible and sometimes directly conflicting values. And the corporation can much more easily refine those conflicting values outside of its corporate image. But a university in some ways has to be home to those sorts of controversies. We bring our conflicting values with us. And as much as we can be attempt to sort of create an atmosphere in which those conflicting values can civilly engage with each other, we can't get rid of them. And some moments they're going to spark up. Most of the time we're going to labs, we're going to class, we're buying our sandwiches, whatever they might be. Sometimes they're going to conflict with one another. And so I guess the last thing I'd like to say, suggest is we just not fall into the idea that we can't, or we could avoid that simply by maintaining a completely neutral stance. There is, I'll suggest, no such thing. So with that being said, I'll hand things over to